Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Today we return with another question and answer topic that addresses a common misconception. And we will break this up into two sessions because it's actually a large and nuanced subject matter. In this two-part mini-series, we will address the question, is Bhakti Yoga the same as Hinduism? Does following the Bhagavad-gita and following the path of Bhakti make someone a Hindu? The answer is no. However, now let's unpack that answer to understand why Bhakti Yoga is not Hinduism or any religion for that matter. For starters, interestingly, the word Hindu is not found in the Bhagavad-gita or in any of the Vedic literatures. The Vedic literatures contain the original spiritual culture that had been practiced in India for countless generations before the word Hindu was invented by those unfamiliar with Bhakti Yoga or Sanatana Dharma, which we will speak about in a few moments. The word Hindu is actually an adaptation of a Persian word that described the people living in or around the Indus or Sindhu River Valley. The neighboring and eventually invading Muslims called the land on the other side of the Sindhu River Hindustan, and called the people living there Hindus. Eventually, the people who were termed Hindus began to refer to themselves by such a term as well, even though that terminology had been imposed upon them by outsiders. Today, the term Hinduism is like a blanket covering many different beliefs and practices, including demigod worship. Whereas Bhakti Yoga focuses solely on the devotional service of the Supreme Lord, who is the source of all that be. And indeed, Bhakti Yoga had been practiced by many people for centuries before the term Hindu surfaced. And this is because Bhakti Yoga is Sanatana Dharma, our original spiritual dharma or duty, which is to develop love of the Supreme Lord, from whom all things emanate. If we study the Vedic teachings in parampara, which means in disciplic succession, in which the spiritual knowledge is passed down from teacher to student in an unbroken chain, if we study the Vedic teachings in parampara like this, where the knowledge is preserved through the generations, then we learn that the ultimate aim of the Vedic literatures is love of the Supreme Lord or Krishna. While the Vedic literatures do acknowledge empowered souls, very pious living entities, also known as the demigods, the ultimate goal of the Vedic spiritual tradition is reaching Krishna, who is the origin of everything in existence. Krishna himself speaks to this point in the Bhagavad-gita. In the second verse of the 10th chapter of the Gita, Krishna says, "I am the source of the demigods and sages." And some verses later, he says, "I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who perfectly know this engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts." In this latter verse, Krishna references devotional service or Bhakti Yoga rendered to him, the Supreme Lord. So now let's discuss more about how Bhakti Yoga is different from Hinduism. Actually, Bhakti Yoga does not subscribe to the dogma or belief of any particular religion. Rather, Bhakti Yoga is actually what is known as Sanatana Dharma, the eternal, irreducible occupation of every living entity or soul, which is loving devotional service to the Supreme Lord. Let's break this down a bit. The word Sanatana means eternal, and the word Dharma means that quality from which something cannot be separated. Dharma refers to that inherent quality that makes a thing what it is. For instance, the Dharma or inherent quality of water is to be wet. The Dharma or inherent quality of fire is to be hot. The Dharma of sugar is its sweetness. In the same vein, the eternal Dharma of the living entity each and every one of us, is bhakti, or serving the Supreme Lord with devotion. In other words, our inherent quality, our eternal identification, is as a spirit soul who has a loving relationship with the Supreme Lord. We exist to act on that eternal relationship and to serve the Lord with devotion. That is our eternal identification, our eternal Dharma from which we cannot be separated. In the Gita's final chapter, toward the very end, Krishna, the Supreme Lord, instructs Arjuna. He says, "Abandon all other varieties of Dharma and just take shelter of me." In saying this, Krishna sets a spiritual standard for us, that we are to consider all other duties in life secondary to our prime duty of reconnecting with Him, the Supreme or God, through loving service rendered to Him. Now, obviously in the world, this is not being pursued by one and all at the present time. Nevertheless, it is the spiritual standard that we are all meant to aim for. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the graduate study of Bhakti Yoga that comes after our study of Bhagavad-gita, this supreme spiritual standard that we just referenced is reiterated. In the verse that reads, "The supreme occupation, or dharma, for all humanity is that by which people can attain to loving devotional service, or bhakti, unto the transcendent Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self." In this verse, once again, we hear that the supreme or highest dharma or duty for us is to engage in loving devotional service to the Lord. And this is real religion, the real religious principle, the spiritual standard which is set by Krishna himself. Real religion actually is established by God himself. At different times, at different places, and to different people, Krishna appears in different forms and gives spiritual instructions, tailoring those instructions according to what the people can understand and digest at that time, if you will. And that is very merciful of him. He never abandons us, and he wants all jivas, all souls, to reach him ultimately. Thus, he facilitates our connecting to him, reciprocating with us to the degree that we wish to connect with him. This is a big topic for a different class, but it's also useful for us to be aware of in this current discussion. Now, to return to the topic at hand. Krishna himself establishes spiritual principles. Indeed, in the 6th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is stated, "Dharmam tu sakshad bhagavat pranitam." That real religion, or dharma, is established by the Supreme Lord himself. And as we just read on the previous slide, the supreme spiritual principle, our eternal inherent dharma, which never changes, is to love the Supreme Lord, Krishna, by engaging in his devotional service. Krishna states this to Arjuna in the Gita as well, when he advises Arjuna to abandon all other varieties of dharma and simply take shelter of him. And how do we take shelter of him? Via devotional service, or the practices of Bhakti Yoga. In the verses just prior to this one, Krishna says to Arjuna, "Because you are my very dear friend, I am speaking to you my supreme instruction, the most confidential knowledge of all. Hear this from me, for it is for your benefit. Always think of me, become my devotee, worship me, and offer your homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you are my very dear friend." So Krishna himself gives us the prime spiritual principle in the Bhagavad-gita. It's in our best interest to pursue that principle in this lifetime and to make it the overarching goal of our lives. It is, after all, our eternal dharma, our eternal identification from which we cannot be separated. Now, because we have free will, we may choose not to act on it, but it is still our eternal duty, and we will never feel permanently satisfied and fulfilled until we do act on it. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada writes in the purport to one of the Bhagavatam verses that we looked at today. He says, "Herein it is stated that the real religious principle is that which is given by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That principle is stated in the Bhagavad-gita. Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. One should give up all other duties and take shelter of Krishna. That is the real religious principle everyone should follow." Thus, any religion that teaches this principle, to develop a loving relationship with the Supreme Lord by engaging in His service, is actually promoting the spiritual standard of Bhakti Yoga to some degree, whether they realize it or not. Religions that do not promote the principle of loving God via serving Him do not fit into Krishna's definition of what real religion is according to the Bhagavad-gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Chaitanya Charitamrita and other sacred texts. Now, some principles of religions not fitting into Krishna's definition may assist us morally and ethically, but they may not necessarily advance us towards serving Him and reviving our relationship with Him. Thus, Bhakti Yoga is not a religion. It is our eternal identification to engage in loving service to the Lord. It is the spiritual standard at which religions try to aim, at least those religions promoting developing a loving relationship with the Supreme Absolute Truth, or God. Now that we know that Bhakti Yoga is not Hinduism, or any religion for that matter, but is rather a universal spiritual standard, next time we will more deeply explore what Bhakti Yoga is, namely our Sanatana Dharma, our eternal identification or duty. In the meantime, let us know if the points from the session today are clear, because we can address any questions that you have in the next session. Thank you for listening today, and we'll see you next time on Bhakti Fundamentals.